The title of my talk is Science and Religion, the Myth of Conflict. So many people have the impression that there's a conflict between science and religion, and I'm sure you know that, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Catholic scientists like myself are often asked whether we find it difficult to reconcile our science and our faith. And that we find that a lot of Catholic scientists find that a strange question, because there's no need to reconcile things that are not in conflict to begin with. Many of the same things that make us scientists make us Catholic. A sense of wonder at the world, a passionate desire to know the truth, and a deep conviction that everything holds together in some coherent way. Both the Catholic faith and modern science make sense of the world. Science tells us about the things we can observe and measure. The Catholic faith has a much broader scope and tells us and answers deeper questions. Questions about the ultimate cause of the world's existence and order, the purpose of human life, and our ultimate destiny. It tells us about spiritual realities, about God and man, love and truth, good and evil, sin and redemption. The Catholic faith and empirical science are two perspectives on reality, which allow us to see things in different but not conflicting ways. I've been a scientist for 40 years and a Catholic for 64 years, and I know of no scientific fact that conflicts with any Catholic doctrine. So why do so many people think there is a conflict between science and religion? In some cases, it's because they have misconceptions about what science has discovered or about religious beliefs. In other cases, it's because they lump all religion together. So every example of superstitious beliefs or magical practices that they come across is evidence to them of the irrationality of all religion. But perhaps the main reason is that many people fail to distinguish between science itself and a certain philosophy that is often called scientific materialism. This is a crucial point. So what is scientific materialism? Oh, before I go on, how many of you, I think everybody recognizes Einstein. How many of you know who the priest is standing with Einstein? Correct. And so that's at least one thing you will learn from my talk, if nothing else. So materialism is a simple idea. It's that all reality is reducible to matter and its behavior. Scientific materialism, as it's called, or scientific materialists, are people who think that science implies materialism. It's true that many scientists are materialists, as are many people who claim to speak for science, but there are also many scientists who reject materialism. Scientific materialism, despite its name, has no claim to being science. It's just a philosophical opinion. Now, if matter were the only reality, as the materialists believe, then of course God would not exist, because God is not a material being. But the human soul would not exist either. A human being would be no more than a complex structure made of atoms. And everything about a human being would be explainable ultimately in terms of the laws of physics that govern how those atoms move. In other words, scientific materialism implies not only that God does not exist, but that strictly speaking, you and I don't exist either. We're just assemblages of atoms. The popular astronomer, the late Carl Sagan, put it this way. He once wrote, "I am a collection of water, calcium, and organic molecules called Carl Sagan." Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, wrote, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. Now, let me interject that this is actually good news in a way, because there are a lot of people who would be happy to believe that God doesn't exist. And many young people are affected by the new atheism and by the many atheist websites and blogs and books and so on. But if what we were up against was just atheism, that would be one thing. But we're up against much more. These new atheists are really much more radical, because they say not only doesn't God exist, but your soul doesn't exist. You don't have free will. You're just a machine, a biochemical machine. And that sort of works in our favor, because while many people might be happy to believe God doesn't exist, very few people want to believe that they don't exist and that they don't have free will, and so on, and that they don't have souls. Now, that's what scientific materialism as a philosophy says. But for some people, it's more than just a philosophy. It's a passionately held ideology that sees science as having a saving mission. That mission is to free the human mind from irrationality and superstition, among which they count religion. The ideology of scientific materialism has a well-developed critique of religion, which has at least three aspects: philosophical, historical, and scientific. The philosophical claim of this ideology is that there's an inherent conflict or contradiction between the scientific and religious outlook. Science, apart from anything science has discovered, the outlooks are radically opposed. Science is based on reason and evidence, whereas religion, they say, is irrational because it's based on dogma, faith, and mystery, which involve belief in things which cannot be seen and for which supposedly there's no evidence. Science is based on natural explanations and natural laws, whereas religion is based on miracles and the supernatural. They see religion as a matter of myth and magic, and therefore the very opposite of a rational scientific outlook. The historical claim of this ideology is that religious believers and institutions have been hostile to science and have tried to suppress it. This is powerfully symbolized in the eyes of many people by the Catholic Church's treatment of Galileo 400 years ago. And this impression is constantly being reinforced in the public's mind by the never-ending battles against evolution waged by fundamentalist Christians. The ideology's scientific claim is that the actual discoveries of modern science over the last 400 years or so have debunked or undermined basic Christian beliefs about the universe and humanity's place in it. As the story is often told, and this is the story I grew up with, and many young people grow up with now, science has dealt one blow after another to the religious picture of the world, starting with Copernicus, who showed that the human race is not at the center of the world, at the center of the universe. Newtonian physics showed that nature has no purposes or goals, but is purely mechanical and rigidly governed by blind and impersonal forces. Modern astronomy showed how small and insignificant we seem to be compared to the whole universe. Darwin, some say, showed that human life is nothing but an accident, and that human beings differ only in degree from lower animals, not in any fundamental way. Advances in neuroscience and artificial intelligence are thought to be demonstrating that the supposed soul is nothing but the workings of the brain, a complex biochemical computer. And modern cosmology is invoked to show either that the universe had no beginning or that the universe created itself out of nothing by a quantum fluctuation. So in this first lecture, that's their threefold, three-pronged attack on religion. So in this first talk, I'm going to focus primarily on the philosophical and historical claims. That religion in general and Christianity in particular are inherently contrary to science and historically have been its enemies. In the remaining lectures, 2 lectures, I'm going to actually discuss some of the things that modern physics has discovered and argue that that in fundamental ways they're more consistent with what Catholics believe than with materialism and atheism. So today is sort of more philosophical and historical, and then I'll get into physics more in the other lectures. So let me start with the idea of the natural order. As I said, there is the opposition is supposed to be between the naturalism of science and the supernaturalism of biblical religion. Now, Christianity and Judaism were never based on supernaturalism, if you mean by that a rejection of the idea that there is a natural order. In fact, scholars tell us that the book of Genesis was in part an attack on the supernaturalism and superstition of ancient pagan religion. When Genesis said that the sun and moon were merely lamps placed by God in the heavens to light the day and the night, it was opposing the paganism that worshipped the sun and moon as gods. And when Genesis said that man was made in the image of God and was to exercise dominion over the animals, Genesis was, among other things, opposing the paganism in which human beings worshipped and bowed down to animals or to gods made in the image of animals. In paganism, the world was filled with occult forces and supernatural, populated by numerous deities, gods and goddesses of the oceans and forests, of wind and fire and lightning, of sex and fertility, and so on. Jews and Christians taught, however, that there's just one God who is not to be sought within nature, within its forces and phenomena, but who is outside of nature, and in fact, the author of nature. He is beyond nature and its creator. In this way, biblical religion stripped the physical world of divinity and made it into a natural world, no longer the abode of gods, but the creation of God. And because God is good, and the natural world he's created was seen as something good and worth studying. And because God is intelligent and wise, the world he made must reflect this. It must therefore have been made according to principles and laws that can be discovered and understood by reason. Biblical religion then taught that there exists a natural order which comes from God. And what characterizes this order and reflects the rationality of its creator is precisely that it is orderly, harmonious, lawful. Consider this passage from the letter of Clement to the church in Corinth. Clement was the third pope after St. Peter. And this famous letter that he wrote to the church in Corinth was written about 97 AD. So here's a small excerpt. The heavens, as they revolve beneath his government, do so in quiet submission to him. The day and night run the course he has laid down for them. Sun, moon, and the starry choirs roll on in harmony at his command, none swerving from his appointed orbit. Laws of the same kind sustain the fathomless deeps of the abyss and the untold regions of the netherworld. The impassable ocean and all the worlds that lie beyond it are themselves ruled by like ordinances of the Lord. Upon all of these, the great architect and Lord of the universe has enjoined peace and harmony. Or consider this passage from the 2nd century Christian author Minucius Felix, it comes from a book he wrote trying to convince pagans to believe in the one creator God of Christianity. He wrote, "If upon entering some home, you saw that everything there was well tended, neat, and decorative, you would believe that some master was in charge of it, and that he was himself much superior to those good things. So too in the home of this world, when you see providence, order, and law in the heavens and on earth, believe that there is a Lord and author of the universe, more beautiful than the stars themselves and the various parts of the whole world." So look at what these two passages point to as evidence of God. Not to supernatural phenomena or miraculous departures from the order of nature, but to the order of nature itself and its lawfulness. The ancient argument was that if there is a law, there must be a lawgiver. God was the lawgiver not only to Israel, but to the cosmos itself. God says in Jeremiah chapter 33, verse 25, "When I have no covenant with day and night, and have given no laws to heaven and earth, then too will I reject the descendants of Jacob and of my servant David." Psalm 148 tells of God establishing the sun and moon, the stars in the heavens, by a decree that will not pass away. The idea of God as a rational lawgiver very likely helped give birth to the idea that there are such things as laws of nature. As even some atheists at times concede. For example, the famous biologist Edward O. Wilson, who is an atheist, or at least, well, an atheist, suggested the following as the reason that Chinese civilization, for all its very impressive scientific achievements, did not produce an Isaac Newton or a Descartes. They had abandoned the idea of a supreme being with personal and creative properties. No rational author of nature existed for them. Consequently, the objects they meticulously described did not follow universal principles. In the absence of a compelling need for the notion of general laws, thoughts in the mind of God, so to speak, little or no search was made for them. And the well-known cosmologist André Linde, an atheist, has suggested that the notion that the universe is governed by a single set of laws in all of its parts is historically rooted in monotheism. So now the Catholic faith does, of course, teach that there are supernatural realities, such as divine grace, for example, that have effects in the world. Indeed, but the word supernatural, which literally means above the natural. It would mean nothing unless there were a natural order to begin with. The very idea of the supernatural presupposes that there is a natural order. And the concept of miracles, which are extraordinary events that go beyond what is naturally possible, presupposes that there is a natural order that determines what is naturally possible and what isn't. There's no logical contradiction, as some atheists say, between the idea of miracles and the idea of a lawful universe. But the same lawgiver who established the laws of nature can also suspend or override them for some higher purpose. Because he made the rules, he can make exceptions to them for the sake of this greater purpose. Now, in biblical religion, the ultimate purpose that all miracles serve is the salvation of souls. And as we'll see, the people who led the development of modern science in its first few centuries, the great scientists who were the pioneers in uncovering nature's laws, such as Isaac Newton, were almost all devout Christians who believed in miracles. Now, let me talk about God and nature. There's much confusion today, even among religious believers, about how nature relates to God. Instead of seeing God as the author of nature, they see God and nature as somehow opposed or in competition. So that if something has a natural explanation, then God has nothing to do with it. And conversely, if God is the cause of something, well, then it must be supernatural or miraculous. Many, therefore, look for evidence of God only in what is outside the course of nature or inexplicable by science. That is, in the gaps in our scientific understanding. Hence the expression, the God of the gaps. And atheists think that if those gaps in our scientific knowledge are closed, God will have nowhere left to hide. The traditional Christian view is quite different. If God is the creator of the natural world and established its laws and gave things their natural powers, then his existence is evidence in nature itself and its ordinary processes. This is the message of the following passage from the Book of Wisdom. The Book of Wisdom is a Jewish work written in the 1st century BC that Catholics and the early church regarded as part of Scripture. It's aimed at the pagan philosophers, scientists of ancient Greece. This was a response to a kind of science-religion conflict or perceived conflict back in the 1st century BC. You had the great scientists, philosophers of ancient Greece, such as Aristotle, and you had the Jewish revelation. And the author of the Book of Wisdom was arguing for the truth of Jewish revelation. And he said, for all people who are ignorant of God, were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists. Nor did they recognize the artisan while paying heed to his works, but they supposed that either fire or wind or swift air or the circle of the stars or turbulent water or the luminaries of heaven were the gods that ruled the world. If through delight in the beauty of these things people assumed them to be gods, let them know how much better than these is their Lord, for the author of beauty created them. And if people were amazed at their power and working, let them perceive from them how much more powerful is the one who formed them. For from the greatness and beauty of created things comes a corresponding perception of their creator. Now notice that the evidence of God to which this scriptural passage points consists of phenomena and processes that are perfectly natural. Fire, wind, swift air, the circle of the stars, turbulent water, and the luminaries of heaven. That is the sun, the moon, planets, and stars. Okay. Now, medieval theologians distinguished two ways in which God acts in the world. He can, and sometimes does, act directly in a supernatural manner, and even miraculous manner. For example, turning water into wine. Or he can accomplish his will through the operation of natural causes and processes, which in the terminology of theology are called secondary causes. God is the primary cause. It has always been the Christian view that God ordinarily acts in the latter way, through natural causes. In the words of the great scholastic theologian who lived around 400 years ago, Francisco Suarez, God does not interfere directly with the natural order where secondary causes suffice to produce the intended effect. This principle was important for the founding of science, for it implied that when confronted by some puzzling event or new phenomenon, we should first look for natural explanations. Superstitious people tend to see the supernatural in every unusual or strange event. This was criticized by the great medieval scientist theologian Nicholas Orem, who wrote that in explaining the marvels of nature, quote, there is no reason to take recourse to the heavens, or to demons, or to our glorious God, as if he would produce these effects directly, any more than he directly produces those effects whose natural causes we believe are well known to us. Okay. Another great medieval scientist theologian, Jean Buridan, wrote, the philosophers, meaning scientists, the philosophers explain such marvels by appropriate natural causes, but common folk, not knowing of causes, believe these phenomena are produced by a miracle of God, which is usually not true. That we should seek first appropriate natural causes remains the attitude of the Catholic Church. That's why, in its canonization procedures, the Church does not declare a miracle worthy of belief until it has first excluded the likelihood of natural explanations. That's the default, natural explanation. This brings us back to the all-important theological distinction between primary and secondary causality. I think the failure to understand this distinction by atheists and religious people is one of the main reasons that some people see a conflict between science and religion. I think this goes to the very heart of the problem. Now, I like to explain this distinction by an analogy and by using the terms vertical and horizontal cause rather than primary and secondary. The analogy is to a novel or a play. So consider the play Hamlet. In the play Hamlet, the character Polonius is killed by the character Hamlet, who stabs him through a curtain. So I'm going to ask you a question. We're going to vote. How many of you think, and take my word for that, that does happen in the play Hamlet, okay? Hamlet stabs Polonius and kills him. How many of you think that the cause of Polonius's death is being stabbed by Hamlet? You should all raise your hand. I just told you. Now, how many of you think that the cause of Polonius's death is that Shakespeare wrote the play that way? You should all raise your hands. I gave this talk once in Chicago. I said, look, this Chicago, you can vote twice. Right? You should vote twice because they're both causes of Polonius's death. Hamlet stabbing Polonius is the cause within the plot of the play, what you'd call the horizontal cause. Shakespeare is the vertical cause of the whole play, of all its characters, of all its events, of all the relationship among those characters and events, of the fact that there's a Polonius, that there's a character Hamlet, of the fact that Hamlet stabbed Polonius, and the fact that that caused Polonius to die. The whole ball of wax. He is the author of the whole thing. And they clearly are not in conflict with each other. By analogy, the natural causes within the universe that we all know about and take into account in our daily lives, and that scientists study are the horizontal causes within they're the causes within the plot of nature. Whereas God, as the author of nature, is the vertical cause. Now, theologians, as I said, call these horizontal causes, which we within nature, they call them secondary causes, and God as the vertical cause, as the author of everything, is the primary cause. And this makes it clear how absurd it is to treat evolution and creation as alternatives, as both fundamentalists and atheists do. Did this species of animal arise by natural selection, or by some natural process, whatever it might be, or because God wrote nature's plot that way? Both. This also makes clear why scientific materialists are wrong to think that we believe without evidence. That's one of their main charges. We have no evidence. For a materialist, evidence consists either of directly observing something with our senses, or inferring that something exists as the natural cause of what we do observe. The way we might observe a compass needle move, and we infer that there's a magnetic field as the natural cause of that. Now, clearly, God cannot be seen in either of these two ways, God in his divine nature. For God is not a part of nature, which we can observe with our senses, nor is God a cause within nature, like a magnetic field. And yet God is a cause. He is the ultimate cause. He is not a cause within nature. He is the cause of nature. Thus, nature gives evidence of God in the same way that a novel or a play gives evidence of its author, even if the author does not make an appearance within the book. So we've seen the traditional Christian view of the world has many elements that are conducive to scientific investigation. The world is the creation of a wise and intelligent lawgiver. It is therefore good and worth studying, and is governed by laws and principles discoverable by human reason, which is itself a reflection of the divine reason. It is therefore no surprise that modern science was born in a part of the world whose culture was Christian. What are we to make, then, of the claim that Christianity, and the Catholic Church in particular, was opposed to science and tried to hold it back? So now let me move to the historical attack on religion. This claim is called the conflict thesis by historians of science. Contemporary historians reject it as a distortion of history, and indeed a myth. The roots of this myth lie in the Enlightenment of the 18th century, many of whose thinkers had contempt for revealed religion, and in particular for the Catholic Church. In Catholic countries, this myth was further propagated or cultivated by those who thought the Church was too powerful. And in Protestant countries, it was given a specifically anti-Catholic twist. Many historians of science trace the widespread acceptance of the conflict thesis to two enormously influential books published in late 19th century America. The first was The History of the Conflict Between Science and Religion, written by John William Draper in 1874. And the second was A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom, written by Andrew Dixon White in 1896. I think he was the first president of Cornell University. These books are regarded by professional historians as nearly worthless and filled with gross errors of fact and interpretation. And yet, the myth these books helped to create has become the conventional wisdom, both for the general public and among scientists. Here's what the myth says in broad outline. And this is the myth, this is not me speaking. The tremendous progress made by the ancient Greeks in mathematics and science was halted by the rise of Christianity, which ushered in a dark age for learning that lasted 1,000 years. Only when the West began to throw off the shackles of religion did science begin to revive, at which point it was attacked and persecuted by a hostile church, as as is shown by the condemnation of Galileo in 1633. The overcoming of religious superstition and the development of a rational scientific outlook accelerated during the Enlightenment, and with Darwin came the decisive battle, which is still being bitterly fought. This commonly accepted tale is a fabric of falsehoods and misconception. In the first place, Christianity had nothing to do with the decline of ancient Greek science and mathematics. They were already in decline by 200 BC. The last great scientist of antiquity was the astronomer Ptolemy, who died around 165 AD, at which time Christians were still a small and persecuted sect with little influence on the wider culture. According to the distinguished historian of science, of ancient science, Professor David C. Lindbergh, the early Christians had the same attitudes towards science as their pagan neighbors. When the barbarian invasions brought the Western Roman Empire crashing down in the 5th century, a dark age did begin for learning of all types, at least in the West, including science. The Catholic Church did not cause this dark age, but led the way out of it, not least by keeping literacy and scholarship alive in the monasteries and by copying and recopying the precious and perishable manuscripts that preserved the learning of the ancient world. However, Western Europeans in the Dark Ages, and the Dark Ages, the historians usually date from about 500 AD to about 1000, not to be confused with the Middle Ages, which usually said to begin around 1000 to say 1500 to be. But in the Dark Ages, the Western Europeans possessed very few of the scientific and mathematical books of antiquity. However, around the 11th century, they began to acquire these books through contact with the Arabs and with Eastern Christians, with the Byzantines, and they became aware of the great achievements of the ancient Greeks in science. And a hunger for this knowledge among both the laity and the clergy led to an enormous effort to translate these works into Latin. The medieval universities were founded as places where this newly recovered knowledge could be studied. These universities were the world's first and were Catholic institutions. They were founded under church auspices, they received church patronage and protection, and were staffed largely by clergymen. By the end of the Middle Ages, there were about 100 universities in Europe. What we call science today was called natural philosophy at that time, and indeed well into the 19th century. One indication of how greatly the Catholic Church esteemed science is that in medieval universities, the study of natural philosophy, which included what we would call science, was a prerequisite for the study of theology. This is all the more remarkable given the fact that the science they were studying was of pagan Greek origin. The medieval universities were the first institutions in human history where science was studied and taught on a continuous basis from generation to generation by a stable community of scholars. Before this, it had been more a hit or miss affair, depended on the whims of wealthy or powerful patrons. As the noted historian of science, Professor Edward Grant, has put it, the medieval universities were the first places where science was institutionalized. Moreover, they produced hundreds of thousands of graduates who were introduced to scientific questions and from whose ranks scientific talent could emerge. The scientific community and the scientific public created by these universities, medieval universities, were the soil in which the scientific revolution germinated. Most of the great figures of the scientific revolution, including Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, Kepler, Galileo, Descartes, and Newton, were products of universities that had been founded in the Middle Ages. So I'm going to, for reasons of time, I'm going to skip over the science that was done in the Middle Ages. It used to be thought that medieval science was stagnant, it lacked creativity, it consisted largely of monkish scholars just repeating mindlessly everything that Aristotle said. and that there was no creativity there. That is no longer believed to be true. In fact, medieval science had a lot of vitality and creativity, and there were some truly great figures in the Middle Ages, one of whom I mentioned before, Nicholas Orem. But let me skip over the Middle Ages and talk about the scientific revolution itself. The great figures. Okay, I skipped. That's obviously not a complete list, but among the greatest figures of the scientific revolution happened. Well, Copernicus was in the 1500s, and he sort of sparked the revolution. But the revolution itself really happened in the 1600s. So the great figures of the scientific revolution were mostly deeply religious men. Nicholas Copernicus, whose theory that the earth went around the sun sparked the revolution, was a church official. He was an official of the Catholic Church. Johannes Kepler, famous for his discovery of the 3 laws of planetary motion, was a devout Lutheran. His scientific treatises are filled with prayers and religious reflections. And in his great treatise in which he proposed his 3 great laws of planetary motion, contains prayers such as this: I thank you, Lord God, our Creator, that you have allowed me to see the beauty in your work of creation. Galileo, despite his troubles with the church, remained a devout Catholic throughout his life. René Descartes, whose work in mathematics was foundational for modern science, gave philosophical proofs of the existence of God and the immateriality of the soul. And there's no reason to doubt his sincerity in declaring himself a faithful Catholic. Blaise Pascal was not only a mathematician and physicist of genius, but a religious mystic who wrote his Pensées in defense of Christian belief against radical skepticism. Robert Boyle, generally considered the first modern chemist, left a large sum of money to endow a series of lectures, which I think continues to this day, whose purpose was to combat notorious infidels. That means non-believers, religious non-believers. Isaac Newton, the greatest figure of the scientific revolution, really the towering peak of the scientific revolution, spent as much time in theological and scriptural studies as he did on mathematics and physics. All of them saw their work as showing the beauty of God's creation rather than supporting atheism. And this continued to be the attitude of most scientists for centuries. The 2 greatest physicists of the 19th century were Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell. Einstein, in his study, had portraits of those 2 hanging on the wall. He regarded them as, well, along with Newton, as his great predecessors. Anyway, Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell were both deeply devout Protestants. Where was the Catholic Church during all this, during the scientific revolution? We all know about the condemnation of Galileo in 1633. What is much less known is the enormous positive role the church played in scientific research and discovery from the 1600s to the present day. The historian of science, Professor Lawrence M. Principe of Johns Hopkins University, has written, quote, "It is clear from the historical record that the Catholic Church has been probably the largest single and longest-term patron of science in history," unquote. And one fact that dramatically illustrates the Catholic Church's positive role is the large number of Catholic priests who have made important discoveries in science and indeed were the founders of entire branches of science. This is a largely untold story outside of scholarly books. The Jesuit order was founded in 1540, and within a few decades it was already in the forefront of scientific research. particularly astronomy. Jesuit astronomers played a key role in developing the calendar that the whole world uses today, which is promulgated by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582. The Jesuits have maintained their tradition of astronomical research down to the present time. The Vatican Observatory, which is staffed by Jesuit scientists, continues this tradition today. There are three Jesuit astronomers of the 1600s that deserve particular mention: Scheiner, Riccioli, and Grimaldi. Here is a woodcut, a picture of Christopher Scheiner in his observatory. Scheiner was one of several people who discovered sunspots with telescopes independently of each other. The others were Galileo, Thomas Harriot, and Johannes and David Fabricius. Galileo first figured out what sunspots were, but Scheiner made the most sustained and systematic observations of them. In fact, his data on sunspots is still of use to astronomers today. And here's a picture from his very large treatise on sunspots. You see how much more beautiful diagrams and scientific treatises were in those days. By tracking sunspots as they move across the face of the sun on successive days, this was a cloudy day, so he couldn't observe the sunspots. But these are sunspots traveling across the face of the sun, and then 6 months later, he showed that the sun is rotating on a tilted axis. Giambattista Riccioli developed and calibrated pendulum clocks for the precise measurement of time, and used them to make the first precise measurement of the acceleration of gravity on the Earth's surface, and to study falling bodies. He wrote a technical astronomical encyclopedia which became a standard reference work for astronomers for over a century. Together with a fellow Jesuit, Francesco Grimaldi, he made an accurate map of the moon's surface, which is shown there, and developed the nomenclature now used to describe features of the lunar landscape. Now, most impressively, how many of you are science teachers who have heard of the Coriolis effect? Well, actually, the Coriolis effect, Coriolis lived in the 1800s. The Coriolis effect was actually discovered by Riccioli in the 1600s. So there's an article in Physics Today several months ago about this, that Riccioli discovered the Coriolis effect, and it really should be called the Riccioli-Coriolis effect. Francesco Grimaldi. Again, physics people here, how many have heard of diffraction, the phenomenon of diffraction? Diffraction is an enormously important phenomenon in physics. It shows the wave-like, the diffraction of light shows that light is made of waves. And here are some pictures from the internet of diffraction patterns and phenomena. And those colored bands you see on DVDs and CDs, if people still use those things, are actually diffraction phenomena. Anyway, Grimaldi is the one who discovered diffraction in the 1600s. He named it and made very careful studies of it. It's, as I said, extremely important in physics because we now know that all matter, is not just light, is made of waves. And so diffraction is important in every branch of physics. And there'll be an entire chapter on it in your undergraduate physics textbook and in your graduate physics textbooks. There will be entire chapters on diffraction. Grimaldi is the discoverer of that. Now, the Jesuits did not have all the glory. 4 other priest scientists of the 1600s helped to found entire branches of science. Marin Mersenne was a French priest of the Mennonite order. He is considered the founder of acoustics because of his discovery of many of the basic facts about sound and vibrations. He actually discovered the law of the pendulum, one of Galileo's most famous discoveries, a year before Galileo did. And he made fundamental contributions to the theory of reflecting telescopes. Here's a quote from a book written not long ago, a technical treatise on telescope design entitled Reflecting Telescope Optics. Quote, "Although Mersenne's work is often referred to, its full significance is rarely appreciated. Mersenne must be accorded the credit for inventing, on paper, the definitive basic geometrical form of the modern telescope." Unquote. Now, most important of all were Mersenne's contributions as an organizer of the scientific community. How did people in those days, scientists, learn about each other's work? Well, there was no internet. There were no scientific conferences. There were no scientific journals, as far as I'm aware. It was largely through correspondence among scientists. And one of the central hubs of that web of correspondence was Mersenne himself. His religious house in Paris became a regular meeting place of important scientists, including Descartes, Gassendi, Fermat, and Pascal. In 1653, Mersenne organized the Academia Parisiensis, one of the earliest scientific societies in Europe. The Dictionary of Scientific Biography calls Mersenne, quote, one of the architects of the European scientific community. Benedetto Castelli was a Benedictine priest and a student of Galileo. His book on the measurement of water currents began the modern study of hydraulics. Castelli had two important students. One of them was Evangelista Torricelli, was the first person to create a sustained vacuum and to discover the principle of the barometer and to give the correct explanation of wind. Another student of Castelli's was Bonaventura Cavalieri, a priest, and a mathematician. His so-called method of indivisibles was an important step towards the invention of integral calculus. Later, calculus was discovered independently by Newton and Leibniz. Leibniz himself wrote, "In the sublimest of geometry, the initiators and promoters who performed a yeoman's task were Cavalieri and Torricelli. Later, others, meaning Leibniz and Newton, progressed even further using their work." So Cavalieri is one of the founders of calculus. My last example from the 17th century is Niels Stenson, also known as Nicholas Steno, a remarkable figure in many ways. By the way, I'm almost finished. Steno made fundamental contributions to 4 branches of science: anatomy, paleontology, geology, and crystallography. While still in his 20s, he was recognized already as one of the leading anatomists in Europe. His anatomical studies greatly increased knowledge of the glandular lymphatic system, and various parts of the human body are named after him, including Stenson's duct, Stenson's veins, and Stenson's foramina, whatever that is. I don't know what a foramen is. He also did important work on heart and muscle structure. He was one who showed that the heart is a muscle, and on brain anatomy, as I said, embryology as well. He was a Dane by birth, but eventually ended up in Florence, where he worked in a research institute that included some of Galileo's pupils. In 1666, while he was dissecting the head of a great white shark that had been caught off the coast of Italy, he noticed that the teeth of the shark bore a striking resemblance to the so-called tongue stones that were common on the island of Malta, found often in mountain, in the rocks in rocky formations. This led him to develop, after much geological investigation, a detailed theory of the origin of fossils and of sedimentary rock that was very controversial at the time, but correct. He is regarded as the founder of the study of fossils and one of the main founders of geology. The study of geology led Stenson to the study of crystals, where he discovered the basic fact known as Steno's law, that in all crystals of the same mineral, the angles are the same. Steno was raised as a Lutheran, but after deep study of theology and early church history, he converted to Catholicism. He left scientific research, became a priest, and was soon elevated to the rank of bishop. He was known as an ardent advocate for the poor, for whom he sold all of his belongings, including his bishop's ring. He practiced rigorous asceticism, constantly praying and fasting. In 1988, he was beatified by Pope John Paul II. Now, as science became more specialized, it became increasingly difficult to make fundamental contributions without years of technical training. And because the priesthood also requires lengthy training, it's not surprising that the number of priest scientists tended to decline over time. Nevertheless, in every century, up through the 20th century, there have continued to be an astonishing number of important scientists who are Catholic priests. In the 1700s, there was Lazzaro Spallanzani, one of the leading biologists of that century. He investigated digestion, the dynamics of blood circulation, the regeneration of limbs in lower animals, fertilization, respiration in plants and animals, and the senses of bats. He disproved the theory of spontaneous generation of life from non-living matter. And when Louis Pasteur had to deal with the same issue 100 years later, he based his famous experiments on those of Spallanzani. René Just Houy is considered the founder of the science of crystallography. Giuseppe Piazzi was an astronomer who discovered the first asteroid, which he named Ceres. Ceres is the largest asteroid, in fact, large enough for its self-gravity to force it into a spherical shape, so that it has recently been reclassified as a dwarf planet on the same status as Pluto. There is a picture of Ceres from the Hubble Space Telescope, and there are pictures, close-up pictures by the Dawn spacecraft, which I think went into orbit around Ceres in 2015, I think it was. Bernard Secchi. Angelo Secchi is one of the founders of astrophysics. He pioneered the use of spectroscopy to study the sun and stars. His spectroscopic classification of stars is the basis of the one still used today. And perhaps nothing so dramatically symbolizes the positive relation of science and religion as the fact that Secchi did some of his groundbreaking research using an observatory that he had moved to the roof of Sant'Ignazio, one of the most beautiful churches in the city of Rome. Gregor Mendel. Why did I skip over? I skipped over a very important person. Gregor Mendel is the founder, an Augustinian monk, a founder of the science of genetics. Since this is Notre Dame, I have to point out that Julius Newland, a professor of chemistry at Notre Dame, was the one who helped to develop the first synthetic rubber, neoprene. And I saved the best till last. The main founder of the Big Bang Theory was a Belgian priest and physicist named Georges Lemaitre, who died in 1966. You might say that the Big Bang Theory was too revolutionary for Einstein, even though it was based on Einstein's own theory of gravity. Einstein published his theory of gravity, called general relativity, in 1916. In 1922, a Russian mathematician, Alexander Friedman, and then a few years later, and independently of that, Georges Lemaitre, found solutions of Einstein's equations of gravity that described a universe in which space itself is expanding. Meanwhile, astronomers found evidence that galaxies are flying apart from each other, and it was Lemaitre who combined the astronomical observations with his calculations based on Einstein's theory of gravity to propose what is now called the Big Bang Theory. So, we see that important pre-scientists existed in every century, from the 1100s to the 1900s. They had many firsts to their credit: the Coriolis effect, the diffraction of light, and they were the founding fathers of acoustics, hydraulics, geology, the study of fossils, crystallography, genetics, and Big Bang cosmology. Atheists accuse religious people of believing in myths, but one of the greatest myths in history is the supposed warfare between science and religion. Thank you.